Well, thank you, Father Russ, and thank all y'all for being here today to support me. I've done this a few times before, but I will admit I was nervous at the first service and I left some of the things out that I meant to say. So hopefully I'll get it all out at this service. But when John asked me to do this, I thought, great. I'm going to get up, tell my story like we've heard so many parishioners do over the years. And this is how I got to St. Albans, and this is what I believe. But because Mary Catherine and Paxton and I have volunteered to be part of the bishop's new lay ministry program, he said, that's not what we're doing, Doc. He said, you're going to pick one of the scriptures and you're going to preach on that just like we do every week, because if you get into this program, that's what you're going to have to do. I was like, oh, that's a little different. So I read through them, and the one that really jumped out to me was the gospel reading that Father Russ just read. And primarily because loving the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind is something that I struggle with. And as I did research on this, I found that a lot of people struggle with that concept. And my first thought was, well, I'm going to break it down into 4 parts, and I'm going to do heart, mind, soul, strength, and explain what that's about. But as I started doing research, I discovered 2 things. One, there is a world of information out there about that subject, and there is a lot of difference of opinion between theologians exactly what that means. And also that the central theme of this gospel is not that, but the story of the Good Samaritan. So what I'm going to try to do is share with y'all a few of the things that I learned that I think will help me and hopefully will help you learn to love your Lord, the God, love God, and love your neighbor. Now, the gospel reading today is a story we're all familiar with. It takes place before Jesus has entered Jerusalem, but he's already developed a huge following. Everywhere he goes, there's throngs of people around him. And this is a source of concern for the Pharisees because they view Jesus as a threat to their religion, and they're looking for a way to silence him. And one of the ways that they would do that was by asking him questions, trying to entrap him, hoping he would say something that they could take to the authorities and silence him. But Jesus was always one step ahead of them with his answers. And in today's story, a lawyer, not a lawyer like Chris or Barry or Tom, but an expert in the religious law, asked Jesus a question. And he asked it respectfully. He said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Was it a test? Was it a trap? Probably. But Jesus puts the question back on him. And he says, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" Basically, hey, you're the expert. You tell me. And so he answers, and he quotes Deuteronomy 6:4 and Leviticus 19:18, both of which are central themes of the Jewish faith. And he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, you have given the right answer. Do this and you will live. But trying to justify himself, he took it a step further and said, well, who is my neighbor? Wanting Jesus to say what he had been taught his whole life. Your neighbor is any other Jew. That's what the Jewish faith at that time said. Any Jewish person that is in need of help, you are to help them, but it did not transcend outside of the Jewish faith. But Jesus throws him another little curveball, and he tells him the story of the Good Samaritan. We all know the story. The man's traveling down a road from Jerusalem to Jericho. That was about a 20-mile road. It was a rough road. It dropped about 3,000 feet in elevation, lots of curves, lots of up and downs, and lots of places for bandits to hide. Robbers and robbery were a common occurrence. Most people traveled in caravans or in groups for safety, But for some reason, this person seems to have been alone. We don't know. He may have just been the slowest one in the caravan. But it does tell us that he was laying on the side of the road, half dead. So along comes the priest, and he walks by and does nothing. The Levite comes by, he walks by and does nothing. And then the Samaritan comes. And the scripture tells us that the Samaritan was moved with pity. And he helped the man. He poured wine and oil on his wounds. He bandaged them, put him on his animal, took him to the inn, and cared for him. And when he left the next morning, he gave money to the innkeeper and said, "Take care of this man, and when I return, any additional charges, I will pay you." So after telling the story, Jesus asked, "Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" And the lawyer, really having no choice, said, "The one who showed him mercy." Now, he couldn't bring himself to say the Samaritan because the Pharisees despised the Samaritans. But he did say, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." So there's a few things we can take from this story. The first one is we are called by God to love God and our neighbor. Jesus said in Matthew, all the law and the prophets depend on this. If we don't love God and we don't love our neighbor, all of the other laws and rules, they don't make any sense. We have to love God and we have to love our neighbor for what we believe to make sense. The second one is looking at Jesus using a priest and a Levite and a Samaritan. You know, why did he do that? There's a lot of commentary on this and a lot of different commentary. He could have just said a man was walking down a road and he got robbed and was laying on the side of the road. Man walked by and didn't help him. Another man walked by and didn't help him. And a third man walked by and he stopped and helped him. It's the same story. But he used the Levite and the priest because they, in one sense, they had an excuse. If either one of them touched that man, if he was dead, if he was bleeding, if he was not a Jew, then they were going to be considered unclean. And they had to go through a week-long purification process before they could go back into the temple. But you'll notice Jesus didn't cut them any slack. He said, who is the one who was the neighbor? And the other, that is, I think, and a lot of theologians think, and I agree with them, that Jesus was kind of using this as a slap in the face. He was putting the lawyer in his place. This Levite and this priest, those are your people. That's you. You would have walked by this man and not helped him. But this Samaritan, this person that you just despised, he's the one who stopped and did good. And so in doing that, he really put the lawyer who asked a question back in his place. And Jesus did that all throughout the scriptures. If you read them, every time the Pharisees challenged him, he put them in their place. Billy Graham said about this story, everyone on this planet is our neighbor. We are all called to help wherever and whenever we can. Remember, at some point, we are all going to be the person laying in the ditch. We're all going to be the one hoping that someone will love us enough to help us. Jesus wasn't just talking to the lawyer when he said, go and do likewise. He was also talking to us. So now I'm going to share with you all Diana's story. And it's an example of sometimes helping doesn't go the way you plan. And I'm doing this primarily because when I told Diana that I was going to be preaching on this, she said to me, well, you need to be funny. You need to be like John. So thank you for destroying all my confidence. I am not John. There's only one John, hands down, and I think most of y'all agree. best preacher I've ever heard. Just consistently best I've ever heard. And this is not a funny subject. I know. I Googled jokes about the Good Samaritan. There aren't any. Okay. So those of you who know Diana know that there are 1,000 stories about her, and they all involve things happening to Diana that would never happen to anybody else. In fact, a lot of our friends have said, someday you really need to write a book. And Lauren's laughing because she knows what story this is. I get a call from Lauren one day. I'm at the office, and she says, you need to come home and see what Mom's done. And she's laughing. And so I was like, oh, Lord, help us. What has she done now? And I came home, and I found her in the bedroom, and she had her shirt off, and her back was all covered in these big red whelps. And I'm like, okay, Diana, what happened? And so she told me the story. And y'all, the ones you know, we live right by the city lake. And so we drive past it all the time. Well, this lady had come up there. She was homeless, and she had built this structure out of primarily beer cans, but aluminum cans. It was probably about 3 feet by 3 feet. And she would sit behind it every day. And so Diana had mentioned before, and to her credit, Diana really does have a servant's heart and a soft heart. And she'd said, I really want to do something to help that lady. And I had warned her because I had had an encounter with her. And I said, she's not all there, dear. You need to be careful. But Diana, being Diana, decided that she would fill up a bag with grapefruit from our backyard, and then another bag with canned meats that she had bought for hurricane preparedness. I mean, they'd just been sitting in the pantry like always happens with those. And so she thought, well, I'll take them over and give them to her and help this lady. So she puts them all in her 2 bags, and she goes walking over to the lake. And she said, and when she told me the story, and I'm going to clean up the language, obviously, but she said, as she walked up to the lady said, get away. And Diana, being Diana, said, no, I'm here to help you, and kept walking up. They said, get away. And she said, no, I'm here to help you. And the lady says the 3rd time, get away. And Diana says, no, I'm just going to set these down. So she walks over and she sets them down. And when she does, the lady jumps up and says, get away. And she grabs a bag of grapefruit. And she chases Diana all the way to our house, pelting her in the back with grapefruit. And I can tell you from looking at her back, this lady had an arm like a major league pitcher. I mean, all you say is grace of God, she didn't pick up the bag of cans. So sometimes when we try to help, it's not going to go the way we expect. And we're all going to cross paths with someone in our lives who needs our help, who we want to help, that doesn't want our help and won't accept our help. But we're still called to love them. And I believe we're still called to pray for them. Because even though it's a problem that we can't solve, you've got to remember there's no problem that's too big for God. And now I want to go back to the very first part. Loving God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. You know, it's not the loving God part that I struggle with. I believe I love God. I think we all believe that we love God. We all know how to love. We all have people in our lives that we love. But Jesus also said, whoever loves his father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves his son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And that's the part of it that I struggle with, and I think a lot of people struggle with. You know, I don't know how to love somebody more than I love my family. I don't think I can love somebody more. I told the story at Lauren's wedding about how the first time that they put her in my arms, you know, and I saw her and looked down and, you know, this little red face and cone head and the little cap on it and all. And I said, well, she was. And, you know, I just fell in love with her. And I said, and it's true, from that day And every moment in between, as much as God made it possible for me to love her, I have. And it's the same thing with Tegan, same thing with Quinn, same thing with Brendan. First time I saw them, first time they put them on, I fell in love with them. So I don't know how to love somebody more than I love Diana or Tegan or Quinn or Brendan or Lauren. I don't know how to do that. And a lot of people struggle with that, and I found that in reading, in the research that I had done. Billy Graham said, "No human being has ever loved God with all their heart and soul and mind all their lives. And no human being ever will love God with all their heart and soul and mind all their lives." Can't be done. No matter how hard you try, you will never love God with all your heart this side of eternity. And that was a young preacher who I'm going to quote again in just a minute. And I listened to his sermon, and I didn't write his name down, and I couldn't find it, so I'm sorry. But Rick Warren said, and this is pretty prophetic, "The world is full of people who claim to love God, but do not back it up with their lifestyles." But as I read through most of the commentaries by well-known clergy and seminarians, everyone pretty much had the exact same perspective. Our being able to love God has to start with us recognizing and accepting God's never-ending, never-changing love for us. We have to believe that even when we sin, God still loves us. Even when we don't love others, God still loves us. He just wants us to do better. And this was my favorite explanation of all that I read, and it's very short and simple. And it was by the same young preacher. And he said, all our lives, we are called to love God. Not just the idea of God. God is holy. He is majestic. We are called to love God because he is worthy of our love and adoration. He has loved us immensely, and we love him out of an overflow of his love for us. We don't just love God to get his favor or his blessings. God is not a genie in a bottle. He deserves all our love, all of our praise, and all of our worship forever and ever. In the scriptures, God's love for us is both a feeling and an action. Our love for God and our neighbor needs to be the same. And in closing, if you do struggle with this, you can take comfort in this. It comes from what's called the Heidelberg Catechisms. It was a series of teachings written in the 1500s for the Reformed Lutheran Church. And it reads, "True believers' love of God with their heart, soul, mind, and strength, as imperfect as it may be in themselves, is acceptable to God because of Jesus Christ." And again, true believers' love of God with their heart, soul, mind, and strength, as imperfect as it may be in themselves, is acceptable to God because of Jesus Christ. In trying to love God with all our hearts, as in everything else in our lives, we need Jesus. With Jesus, it is enough. With Jesus, it's always enough.